Alright, so for finishing off your piece, once you've reached the end of your working area, you'll need to weave back in some of your weft threads just so that they can stay anchored in place and they don't make your piece fall apart. We'll get to actually finishing off the piece later, and you can decide what you want to do with it depending on how long you've made it. But first things first, you need to actually weave back through some of your prior rows to anchor that thread back in place. So I have just a teeny tiny little thread on this one, like the tail is not very long. You really want to give yourself more tail than I have. This is maybe 5 inches. 6 inches is really the shortest you want to go, because you want to be able to move that needle around and you want to be able to actually weave it back through those beads. So when you're finishing off a row, I recommend going to the previous row and going back through. I'm going to try not to block my camera too much. And then come back to that final row again and go back through. This will help keep the end nice and strong, and you'll want to do that on both ends. Now, I do still have a little bit more tail, and I want to weave a little bit more of this back and forth. So I'm going to go in the first 2 beads of each row. 1, and if I can hook it in there, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. You'll notice that I'm not going all the way across the row. You don't need to either. Again, this is just to help anchor that thread in place, and this way you don't have to worry about any knots in random places or unsightly lumps and bumps. If your beads were a little bit inconsistently sized, you don't have to worry about messing those up. Once you've gone back through a few rows, I'm actually just going to go most of the way through this last row that I'm weaving in, and I'm not going to go all the way to the end. And this is in part because once I get that thread pulled through, I'm actually going to cut it right up next to the woven area. This way that thread can kind of just sit in there, and now that part is finished. I've woven in my end, and this piece of my beadwork should be nice and strong. When weaving any extra pieces you had, because you had to add another weft thread, because your first one or first ones weren't long enough, these ones you don't necessarily have to do the back and forth between a full row to start with, because they've already been through, and we still want it to be nice and flexible. With these ones, I'm going to recommend that you just do the back and forth between a couple beads of a few rows. So you'll come through, depending on how wide your piece, you can do 2 or 3. Depending on how long your thread is, or your tail, you can do a couple of them before pulling your thread tight. So I just did 3 rows of 3. And I'm actually going to go back up through. Again, this is just to make sure that even if you have it on something that gets a lot of wear, you don't undo all your precious beadwork. And again, I'm going to come back through part of the way. On this last one, I'm going to pull it tight, and I'm going to clip my string right next to my beadwork. Be careful that you don't clip a warp thread. Otherwise, you are in for a very, very sad realization in that you'll have to start over. So that's it for finishing off your pieces as far as weaving back in the weft threads. In the next video, I'll go over how to cut it off the loom and finish the piece overall.